Black Friday is coming, and for the adults in your life who love the coolest toys, well, there's something for them this year too. Bartesian is the premier craft cocktail maker that automatically makes more than 60 seasonal and classic cocktails, each in under 30 seconds at the push of a button. And right now, Bartesian is having a huge site-wide sale. You can get $100 off any cocktail maker or cocktail maker bundle when you spend $400 or more. So, if the cocktail lover in your life has been good this year, or the right kind of bad, get them Bartesian. At the push of a button, make bar-quality cosmopolitans, martinis, Manhattans, and more. All in just 30 seconds. All for $100 off. Amazing toys aren't just for kids. Get $100 off a cocktail maker when you spend $400 through Cyber Monday. Visit bartesian.com/cocktail. That's BARTESIAN.com/cocktail.
Welcome to Mind Love Premium, episode 88. Today's episode is all about how your movement impacts who you are.
How I move impacts my mental health, not just how I operate in the world. And that to me was a piece that, even if people understand it, was missing from the story. People weren't necessarily going into depth as to how our movement and movement patterns contribute to our thought patterns. And so often we hear, change your mind, change your movement, change your thoughts, change your body. I really wanted to make sure that there was a mainstream narrative that talked about it from the other perspective, that if you don't know how to change your thoughts or don't think you can, we have to start in the body, and small micro movements are the way to do that.
It's a new day, a new episode, and a new opportunity to subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you always know about new episodes. Plus, it makes you one of my favorite people. Because the more subscribers I have, the more I attract amazing guests to help better serve you. So don't forget to subscribe. What if I told you that the way you move impacts the person that you are? And if you consciously begin to move differently, your whole life could change. It sounds surprising at first, but think about it. You've probably watched Amy Cuddy's TED Talk about power posing. And if you haven't, you really should, because you're like the only one in the world who hasn't. Seriously, that shit got like 65 million views. But I'll give you the rundown. We can often tell when someone is confident or insecure by the way that they carry themselves. But you can also reverse it. If you're feeling insecure and you stand in what she calls a power pose, so imagine standing up tall with your hands on your hips like Wonder Woman, you can actually feel more confident. Also, studies have shown that smiling makes you feel happier, or that moving sensually makes you feel more sensual. To me, it's a prime example of fake it until you make it. I don't love the phrase fake it so much because there's just a lot of connotations there, but another way to word it is do something until it starts to feel more natural. I'm pretty sure that every change I've ever made in my life has felt foreign at first. But if it's not something I'm used to doing yet, of course it's going to feel weird. And some people give that foreign feeling meaning and say, well, this just doesn't feel like me. And my response to that is, it doesn't feel like this version of you, or it doesn't feel like the person you want to be. Because both of those people are still you. You aren't this static being who will never evolve from the person you were in childhood. Our brains are these powerful machines that seek to make new connections and learn and grow and transform the human that they belong to. And if you want to go a level deeper, our souls chose life to experience human existence and transform as we find meaning in that life. When I was pregnant, I fell into a period of depression. I hadn't felt that way since I was in my early 20s, and frankly, it was pretty humbling. I had the tools this time to help myself out of it. But of course, it took me a while to remember that I had that power because the dark cloud just felt so thick. A huge part of my process was doing things that I know logically lift me up, but felt terrible at the time. I had to tap into the vibrant, happy version of myself, even though I didn't feel like that version of me at all. I didn't want to go on walks or do yoga or be around people. But I knew that those were the things that would be my lifeline. I just had to trust my higher self. And so I did. And little by little, the shell of depression started cracking. But it didn't feel natural or normal at all. I could barely remember what it felt like to be the version of me that happily and naturally did all of those things. It reminds me of Einstein's quote, "You can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it." I'm going to repeat that and really let it sink in. You can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. So if you're feeling stuck or out of control or mentally frenzied, why would we think that doing the same thing that got us there would get us out? We are such multidimensional beings. And I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned in this life is every decision I make, everything I do, impacts the person I'm becoming. Because that's just it. We are constantly becoming. We're never stagnant. So if our smiles and our posture can impact our moods, and our moods impact our disposition, and our disposition impacts our personalities, and our personalities impact what we believe we're capable of, and what we believe we're capable of impacts what we do in this life, then how can we harness the power of movement to become the best versions of ourselves? So if we can change our habits of eating and our habits of thought, why can't we change our habits of movement? And if we change our movement, what kind of ripple effect does that have on our lives? Well, that's what we're talking about today. And our guest is Erica Hornthal. She's a licensed clinical professional counselor and board certified dance and movement therapist. And she's known as the therapist who moves you. Erica's mission is to change the way people see movement with regard to mental health, moving people towards unlimited potential, greater awareness, and purpose by tapping into their innate body wisdom. So 3 key things we will learn are how to identify where you're holding emotions in your body, how to identify your default movement patterns, and how to challenge your movement in small ways to open yourself up for change. Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up or text the word morning to 33777. And now let's welcome Erica Hornthal to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So what interested you in studying movement and body awareness?
I think it all started with just being a kid that loved to move and dance. And thankfully having a caregiver, parent, mom in particular, that thought to put all of that energy into a formal class, right? Like a structure where I could safely experience the boundaries of my own body and express myself creatively through movement. So I think it definitely started from a young age. And, honestly, as I got older, it just more became about preserving that and not wanting to let go of my connection to dance, but also recognizing that professional dance and, choreography or production really wasn't going to be in the cards for me. So I ended up thankfully finding the field of dance movement therapy, which really brought together my love for helping people and talking to people and using my body as a tool for expression, as a tool for relationship, and a model for intervention within the therapeutic relationship. And so I think naturally from getting my master's in dance movement therapy, my interests were piqued through just awareness in general and how we can use our bodies to be more aware of our mental health. So was I always aware of my own body? Certainly not. I turned that off very easily, very quickly when I was younger. And did I understand the power of body awareness? I would say not really until maybe the last 10 years, probably 5 or 6 years more solidly, but definitely within the last 10 years. So body awareness is, I always say, like, it's still something I'm working on. And, writing about it was just kind of me supporting myself and also being able to share with people this journey, right? Parallel process, if you will, that we can go on it together.
I totally relate to turning your body off at a young age. I had a pretty severe eating disorder for like 10 years. And not only that, but just like binge drinking in my 20s and party drugs, and then being prescribed Adderall for years and years. When I remember first starting to try to tune into my body, and I like couldn't feel certain things. And it reminds me of when you are building muscle in certain places and you start to, maybe you're doing like a Pilates class or something like that, and they're like telling you to like move your leg in a certain way, and you're like, I don't even know if my leg moves that way. But then like 3 months down the line, you're like, oh yeah, I feel exactly the muscle that they're talking about. But before you actually work it, maybe it's because it has no strength that you can't feel it. And so turning into my body was a whole new process.
Absolutely. And, there's so many different types of awareness, right? We can talk about kind of that external, internal awareness, right? Being aware of how something feels externally, or how to manipulate, like you said, a certain muscle or certain part. And then actually having that interoceptive approach, right? Like that internal approach to what am I feeling in my body? How do I connect to this part of the body that actually allows that part to move? I've experienced that myself. I've certainly heard it from clients, friends, colleagues, that are similar, went to a yoga class or a Pilates class or something, and they're like, hey, can you move this part? And either they say, aren't I? Aren't I already moving that part? Or I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. I don't know how to access that part of my body. And it's totally teachable. I think oftentimes it starts with that inside out approach, because we can't necessarily move or be in relationship with something we don't have a connection with.
Yeah, I actually was just thinking about this the other day, because I remember going to an acro yoga class years ago, and this woman was trying to teach me how to spread my toes. And I was like, my pinky toe just doesn't move like that. And today I was in yoga and I was looking up at my feet because I was on my back, and I was moving my pinky toe. And I thought to myself, she was right. Like, it just took a couple of years of me being like, I can move you, pinky toe. I can move you. Right. And it's interesting because we hear a lot about body awareness from different perspectives, but one thing that I was really drawn to your work is that you talk about how the way we move actually impacts who we are. When did you begin to discover that?
I guess in some part, I always intuitively knew that. But again, like going through school as a dance movement therapist, that was not a narrative. That was not something that I heard, remember hearing anyone say, change the way you move, change the way you live, or who you are is how you move. As I began to research it, because I was really interested in it myself, yes, there are people that have been talking about that since probably the beginning of time, but people like Joseph Pilates, right, talking about changing your movement to actually, improve not just our physicality, but our mentality as well. So honestly, I think when it first hit me, and not from a mental health perspective, but just biomechanically, I was reading a book by Katie Bowman, who is a biomechanist. I think it was the book Move Your DNA or Movement Matters, one of the two. She has so many amazing books. And it was in there that she wrote basically like how you move is who you are. And when I read that, it just immediately hit me like, yeah, I get that. I say that all the time. But for me, it was more of how I move impacts my mental health, not just how I operate in the world. And that to me was a piece that, even if people understand it, was missing from the story. People weren't necessarily going into depth as to how our movement and movement patterns contribute to our thought patterns. And so often we hear, change your mind, change your movement, change your thoughts, change your body. I really wanted to make sure that there was a mainstream narrative that talked about it from the other perspective, that if you don't know how to change your thoughts or don't think you can, we have to start in the body, and small micro movements are the way to do that.
What does this mean for people? What types of movements are bad for mental health? What types of movements are great for mental health? And how do we start to check in where we might be right now to see if there's something that we need to shift?
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
What types of movements are bad for mental health? What types of movements are great for mental health? And how do we start to check in where we might be right now to see if there's something that we need to shift?
Oh my gosh, those are such good questions. So I'll try to break it down a little bit, right? So your first question was what movements are bad for mental health, right? Because so often we think all movements good for mental health. Right? If we get our bodies moving, then our endorphins, are there, serotonin levels change. And I always like to point out that we have to be sensitive to how the way we're moving when we exercise in particular perpetuates the stress cycle that we're in. So as an example, we hear like fight, flight, or freeze usually. If we're a flighter and in our exercise, we like to run, we just have to make sure that we're not perpetuating the run cycle, that we're actually allowing ourselves to complete the stress cycle so that we're not constantly physically and emotionally running from things. And so what might that look like? I always support or try to spread the idea of creating a well-rounded or diverse movement profile. So while, let's say, a runner might not want to be a Tai Chi, engage in Tai Chi. I mean, I'm just making assumptions kind of, but like if I'm a runner and Tai Chi or yoga or something slower paced makes me cringe, or it's just not my cup of tea, it doesn't mean we have to engage in a 30 to 60 minute practice, but for our body to engage in new habits and patterns, it's beneficial to try all different types of movement, different pacing, different intensities, different rhythms. So is it bad movement? No, it's just patterned movement. And so what's good movement for mental health? It's getting us out of our comfort zone. And it's not pushing ourselves because we don't want to, again, trigger ourselves or overwhelm the system more so. We want to diversify the system. So no one ever grows if we don't change, right? And so even thinking about how I move today, and if we're thinking about exercise in particular, am I always doing the same exercises? Like I love dance, but I really try hard not to only engage in one style or one class all the time, because then my body, just like our muscles, get used to it. And there's no growth, right? There's no physical growth. There's no emotional growth. And we can actually perpetuate stuckness. We can keep ourselves right where we are. So what people can do is start looking at ways they're already moving, right? What are my normal movement habits or exercise patterns? And what are some things that might be out of my comfort zone that I might indulge in, right? Or just start to ponder. If the thought of actually going and doing it is overwhelming, then we, just backtrack a little bit. But it doesn't have to be exercise. I think of just how I walk, how I sit, how I gesture, how I speak to my kids, how I talk to my family, my neighbors. Start looking at those small ways that I show up in my body. And if I can start to shift them, literally shift them, that's a step in the right direction. So hopefully that answers your beautiful questions, because those are books in themselves.
Yeah, I was thinking about my own life and my movement patterns. And I did just get home from a yoga class. Mm-hmm. And I've always really loved trying out different types of workouts. Like back when I lived in LA and ClassPass, I was all over the place. I was doing CrossFit and Pilates, but I always come back to yoga, at least for the last since 2007. And so yoga is my main practice. And so I was thinking as you were talking, when there's times that I'm doing only yoga as my main physical movement, potentially that could be bad because it's just one pattern. Is that correct?
Yes and no, right? So if you're using yoga as your home base, let's say, right, that's where I center, it's where I ground myself, I can be most present, then yeah, we want to keep that habit, that ritual, so to speak, because that can be what really keeps us connected to the present moment. It can keep us feeling a sense of safety and security in our body when God knows the world is less than, right? So again, I think it's this check-in. We have to have this constant, maybe not constant, but we have to be able to check in with ourselves and ask, how is this serving me, right? And am I getting good from this? Good meaning purpose. Am I feeling more balanced, more connected? Am I on autopilot? When we move from habitual places, oftentimes our mind isn't focused on the movement. That's when our body has muscle memory. We're going through the motions and we're not bringing in the emotions. And that's a problem, right? So we can say, but I practice all the time. I'm always exercising. I do these meditative practices. I do these grounded techniques. Why am I still so anxious, right? Like my psychiatrist or my doctor or my neighbor says, do this, it'll make you feel better. But if we're not mindful and bodyful while we're doing it, that's a problem. So my answer to that is just, are we on autopilot when we're doing these forms of movement? And if that's the case, then you can keep doing them, but switch it up, right? So if I'm always used to doing the same teacher, the same class, the same time, same day, can I change my schedule a bit? Instead of doing it on Wednesday, maybe I do it Friday. Maybe instead of doing it at night, I do it in the morning. And I know that's hard because people's schedules are what they are. We've got kids, we've got work, etc. But looking at opportunity and possibility within the movement ritual, within the structure. And again, asking myself, am I mindful? Am I in a place where I'm paying attention to what's happening? Or is what I'm doing contributing to that autopilot, which is what keeps us stuck and keeps us in those, again, stress cycles that are unhealthy.
I have to look at the full picture of my movement too, though. And I do long walks. And then I have a 15-month-old. And so I liken that to being a full all-day intermittent kettlebell class because I'm just like lifting.
if you have a little kid, you're moving all the time. So you're good.
Yeah, so that's good. But I will say right now, in order to keep my sanity, I am so structured. Like I get up at the same time. I do this. I meditate the first thing. I take my vitamins. I come and get some writing done. I wake up my baby. Like every day is so structured right now, which is just so funny because it's the opposite of what I've ever been in my life. And so I love the idea of still having your structure, but there's something I used to do before I had a kid. And I had basically a list of like movement things, mindset or mental health things such as meditation or breath work or like a few of those things. Cause I've always been a based on my moods type of person. So I'm like, well, I don't want to meditate. Okay, I'll do breath work instead. And that way I'm still getting kind of all that mind, body, and spirit. But for listeners out there that might not have a practice in any of these things, how can they best gauge where they are in their bodies right now so that they know where they're starting from?
Oh, yes. Perfect. Great question, right? So I think the most basic thing, again, we talk about awareness, right? Body awareness is taking time to ask, what am I aware of in this moment? So what parts of my body am I really focused on? Because that usually tells us what parts are either super activated, right? Either like holding our pain or our tension or our stress. It also highlights the areas of our body that we're not tuned into. So I'll use myself as an example. I'm very body aware, but I'm always aware of my shoulder and my neck because my shoulders and my neck is where a bulk of my tension and stress rests. Even if I'm not feeling stressed, it's how I sit too. I've become so accustomed to sitting at this desk, which is not ergonomic by any means. It wasn't supposed to be. I don't really do a lot of work here except when there's a pandemic. So, I rest my shoulders. I'm sitting with my chin on my hands. I'm leaning into my screen. I'm putting a lot of load on my shoulders. And so an area that's already prone to stress just constricts and gets tighter and tighter. Meanwhile, I'm not paying attention to my lower body. So it's really just starting to take time to become aware of how am I showing up in my body right now? Again, using myself as an example, I'm sitting on one of my legs. And until I realized how I was sitting, I didn't even realize that my left foot was asleep. So I'm going to take this time now to actually not sit on my leg, which I do all the time, put my feet on the floor, which is a way to ground myself. And then I can become aware of my lower body, my knees, my calves, my shins, my thighs, my butt, my hips, and start to stack myself back up. So again, it's not so much about what movement I can bring into my day. It's what movement's already happening, or not happening. And so if you're feeling really disconnected from your body or from movement in general, take opportunities to just start to become aware of what you're doing in any given moment. And if that's hard to do or hard to remember, I literally will use or tell clients to use a phone. Set a reminder on your phone. Go back to good old Post-it notes and put a Post-it note wherever you frequent. If you're always opening the refrigerator on a daily basis, put a sticky note on your refrigerator that says, how are you moving today? Have you checked in with your body? What parts aren't moving right now? Because we're always moving. There's always some movement happening, even if it's involuntary, like our breath or our heartbeats. But we're not accustomed to tuning into it. We don't really pay attention, and we don't want to, right? Because it's like, oh, it happens automatically. I don't really need to be aware of it. It's something my body does on its own. But that doesn't mean it's helping. It doesn't mean that it's the healthiest way that it's happening. So like you said, we might look into breath work or, looking at the ways that what we're doing isn't necessarily supporting or helping us in the healthiest way possible. So, try not to get overwhelmed by the thought of bringing in more movement or creating exercise or even a routine at all. It's literally just about building awareness around how I'm moving and how I currently am on autopilot with regard to movement.
Yeah, and I think some people think that because something's on autopilot, sort of like you said, they're just like, oh, well, my body's handling it. It's on autopilot, or it's even a part of my autonomic systems. But you can still build bad habits because those autonomic systems are working in relationship with your other emotions and the energy that you're carrying. And so an example of this that comes to mind is like breathing. Of course, breathing comes naturally to all of us. It just happens. But over time, certain people, especially people that tend to hold more stress, their breathing becomes shallower. And the way to combat that is to actually consciously take deeper breaths. And at first people are like, but then I have to think about it to take deeper breaths versus it just happening. Like, this is the way it just happens. It just happens shallow. It's impossible to always be focusing on deep breathing. But what happens is that the more that you focus on that, the more that starts to build into your natural patterns. And over time, you start to breathe deeper. So the same thing can happen with our movements when we're acting restricted. And I'm reminded about how when I was really deep in my eating disorder and I started to build body awareness, I noticed that one of the things that I would do is I would not even just slouch. It was like I was picturing my whole front abdominal area like shrinking inward. Like that, it was my way of like sucking in, hiding, becoming smaller. And over time, that was originally so deeply ingrained, but over time, I focused on enough expansiveness and at first just thought about the word and then maybe dropped my shoulders back, opened up that area. And now my default is to sit in a more expansive way. So that sounds like an example of what you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. And even considering, how this posture perpetuates the mindset, right? Or vice versa, how my mindset is perpetuated by this posture. They go hand in hand, right? The whole mind-body connection. And, while it's not a specialty, I've definitely had the pleasure of working with quite a few people that identify as, having disordered eating, or actually have a diagnosis of an eating disorder. And sometimes because it's so ingrained in their identity, it's hard to let go of that, right? There's even I don't want to get better for a lot of my clients. This is who I am. This is my identity. If I let go of this, who am I without it? And that's so ingrained in our core. I mean, our spine is where our self-awareness lies. And so there's a resistance sometimes to sitting up straight. There's a resistance to tapping into my self-awareness because there's discomfort, there's pain, there's anxiety, there's so many emotions, right? So I think even being aware can cause a lot of discomfort and anxiety, to say the least. And so being compassionate with how quickly we do those things, how often we engage in an awareness practice, like it's not about throwing ourselves in the deep end, right? It's just about stretching a muscle that's been dormant for a very long time. Because as you said, it's something we've, just like those involuntary movements, it's something we're born with. We have this capacity. It is the first way that we communicate our needs and our wants. We're not verbal. And some people are never verbal. But that doesn't mean that they're not speaking. It doesn't mean that they're not able to communicate what they need and what they want. So it's not even something we have to learn. I always say it's something we have to relearn because it's there. It's just been dormant for a really long time. And we may even be the ones silencing it and perpetuating that disconnect. You know, I identify myself with, I think from a young age, associating the body with pain and illness. You know, that if you're not aware of your body, there was some part of me that felt like, oh, then you're healthy, because you don't have to think about it. And if you're focused on your body, it's because there's disease or sickness or illness. And I don't know, somewhere along the way, I just associated body or being in my body as feeling ill, or like, I know I'm in my body when I'm not feeling well. And I know that's not true anymore, but I really had to meet myself where that was, you know, that we have to go into those uncomfortable or unaware places to start to become more aware of what's there and what we're holding on to. You know, we always want to let go, right? We always want to just get rid of what doesn't serve us, but we can't really let go of something if we don't know where it's coming from and where it lies in our body. And you don't have to overwhelm the system. You don't have to do it all at once. It's just slowly letting the air out of the balloon. In trauma therapy, they talk about as titration, you know, slow, because that's where the sustainability is. That's how that growth and healing happens. It doesn't stay if we just immerse ourselves completely, because then we just freak ourselves out and run away or freeze up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so much of this awareness is like identifying where we're holding tension and just the subtle energy shifts that we feel. And I know it's come up a ton in past episodes about how we hold emotions in our bodies. Mm-hmm. How does things like tension connect with our emotions? And how can we get more clarity on maybe how our body's trying to speak to us about not just what we're feeling, but what we're feeling physically, but what we're feeling emotionally?
A really important question, to say the least. It's the takeaway, right? People are always like, great, but how do I do this? How do I listen to my body? How do I know what it's telling me? Especially because we always try to assign things. We want to place judgment and make assumptions about what we feel or why we feel it. So I always say that, one, it's not about body language. It's really about learning your body's language. And that my body's language is not really going to be like anybody else's, even though there are commonalities. You know, we all move in 3 dimensions. We all have similar movement phrases, but we all have our own signatures, you know, kind of like our own fingerprints, if you will, when it comes to our movement patterns and characteristics. So with regard to really listening and starting to uncover like where I hold my emotions, so it becomes really about noticing the sensations in the body. Because honestly, once there's a thought around it, it's already been in the body for quite a long time. And so then it kind of becomes, how can I shorten the distance, right, between ruminating on it and noticing, maybe not the moment it happens, but start to notice those feelings. So if all of a sudden I'm super aware of how tight my shoulders are, like for me, on a really tense day, if I'm not paying attention, my body lets me know, because at the end of the day, I have a tension headache. And then I think, oh gosh, I should have seen this coming, but I wasn't paying attention. And even myself, I don't always pay attention depending on what's going on around me and how overwhelmed I am. But what I've been able to do is when I'm very mindful, I can actually pinpoint the place in my back. It's right between my shoulder blades where the tension occurs. And there's usually a little knot. And if I tend to that on a semi-regular basis, and that can just be rolling my shoulders, it might be stretching my arms across my chest, sometimes I'll take a softball, a tennis ball, and even if I'm not feeling tension because I know that place is susceptible to it, I will, place it against the wall and just gently like roll my scapula kind of around the ball, or lay down. You can do it with a foam roller. And so I'm kind of learning to speak the language of my body because I know that it's saying like, hey, we're carrying a little stress here. Can you tend to this before it becomes something that's really, really overwhelming and painful and actually wants to take you out of your body, as opposed to like really being focused and trying to listen to it before it becomes unbearable, right? Or starts screaming at us. So some other ways to do this is starting with thinking of certain emotions, and rather than going at like on a 1 to 10, thinking of a 10, start somewhere on like a 4, maybe a 5, a story or an instance that conjures up that emotion, and just notice what parts of your body start to stir when you're thinking of that memory or that emotional situation. If I'm thinking of something that brings me happiness, I always ask my clients, how do you know you feel happy? If you can't speak, can't tell me, could you show me? Or what do you notice in your body that suggests happiness? And when you really start to think about it, because at first sometimes you get this look of like, I don't know, I'm just happy, right? And I'm like, okay, just be with it for a moment. Like, pay attention. What does your body feel as you're happy? And then I'll get, my face is starting to flush, or my cheeks are squeezed, or I'm smiling, or my hands are tingly. Like, these small little sensations start to tell us what we're experiencing as an emotion. Like our molecules all throughout our body that help not only create emotion, but help us feel those emotions. So just really becoming curious about like where these emotions originate and how my body holds them. Start with something that's, I would say, pleasurable, or at the very least benign. We don't want to jump into something that's really heated and triggering for us. But that also allows us to later on feel things that are less than comfortable, and start to identify where we're feeling them. So certain people are going to hold certain emotions in different places. It's not always a universal thing.
That's so helpful, because so often we think, okay, well, I'm feeling a lot in my body. And so then all of a sudden we're like, what does this mean? But when we can actually work reverse, where it's like, I'm feeling so sad right now. How else does this feel in my body? And then maybe later on when you're just going through the motions of life and you're like, all of a sudden feeling those same sensations, it could be your body telling you, hey, slow down. You might be processing some grief that you're not giving time, or something along those lines.
Absolutely. Sometimes we have to, ideally we want to go from that bottom up, but sometimes, especially because we're so cerebral, we need to start from that place of top down, and start with the emotions, start with the judgments, the assumptions that we make, and then notice what the body is saying, even though that's the first place. And then we can reverse it and really go into the body and notice what's happening here and what does this feel like? What emotion do I equate this with? The interesting thing is when I do kind of this mapping, if you will, with clients, we identify so many emotions that overlap in different parts of our body. So we can't just say, oh, my tension's in my chest. Because I've had people say, well, look, I'm happy in my chest. I'm sad in my chest. I'm angry in my chest. But I'm also these things in other parts too. So I can start to decipher, is this anger? Well, you know what? Usually my hands are involved in anger, and my hands aren't feeling anything right now. I think what's telling too are the parts that we're either not listening to, or that aren't speaking, or that everything else is so loud we can't hear them. So if you're tending to focus so much on your upper body and you feel lots there, know that you can go into your lower body to actually help regulate. You can remind yourself to stand on your feet, bend your knees, circle your hips, sway side to side. We get so immobilized and so focused on the parts that are frozen that we forget about the parts that aren't necessarily frozen, but just we're not aware of. So we're very focused on where we feel pain and constriction and frustration and anger and anxiety. And then it starts to overtake our whole body. And then we get this like, I am anxious, not I feel anxious, right? And so you can ask yourself, well, where don't I feel these things, right? Just as much as I said, this is where I feel this emotion, we can also go with, where do I feel the absence of this emotion? Because if it's something that feels very threatening, or very uncomfortable in the moment, perhaps I can go into a part of my body that isn't feeling that way. And I can, kind of oscillate between the two, or I can look for some stability, safety, even some sense of embodied security by going into parts that aren't activated. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay.
And so far we've learned how to build more awareness within our body, how to notice what the sensations are that our emotions hold so that we can work either way and start from one end or the other and learn more about the complete picture. Mm-hmm. And you also talk about, and we also learned about identifying patterns of our own movement so that we can start to break those. And so you also talk about challenging your movement so that we expand beyond our patterns. And I think maybe what you were just talking about, like when your body's calling attention to your shoulders all the time, one of the ways to challenge that, or those are more challenging the feelings, I suppose, is you can tune into some of the other areas. But what are some of the ways that we can actually challenge those movement patterns so that we are not kind of getting stuck in not just those patterns of movement, but just in those patterns of being as well, since these movement patterns do impact who we are?
Yeah, this is something I practice on a regular basis. And again, another question I love to answer. I'll use myself as an example because I think, why not? But if we're looking at exercise, right? I know we're not just talking about exercise, but if you're looking at exercise, going back to what I mentioned earlier in the conversation about diversifying the kind of exercise we're doing, looking at the pace, the tempo, the intensity. If I'm always doing high intensity, can I do something that's lower? If I'm always going very slow in my movements, can I, bring in something a little faster or a more syncopated or even a polyrhythm, multiple rhythms at one time. So that's kind of the exercise piece, and again, I'm not an exercise specialist, a physical therapist, none of those things. So always consult, your doctor or some more professional in those areas. But, diversify your exercise strategies, if you will. But when it comes to challenging just your movement patterns and how we are moving in our body on a regular basis, there's so many great ways. So my favorite exercise, kind of air quote exercise, is just challenging what hands and sides of the body that we use on a regular basis, and try to do it in pretty benign situations. So brush your teeth with your non-dominant hand, brush your hair with your non-dominant hand, high five someone with your non-dominant hand, eat, drink, nothing hot because we don't want to hurt ourselves, but like the ingrained habit of I reach for my coffee cup with my left hand. And I'm really trying to be mindful of like, well, what if I do it with my right hand? Because I'm not a righty. And getting to the point where it might be uncomfortable, but we can be with the discomfort. It's okay to be uncomfortable. We have to manage the discomfort. So a couple examples that I will tell you about myself is, obviously I kind of challenge these things on a regular basis, but through the pandemic, I was not moving in the ways, obviously I'm moving, but I was not moving in the ways that I wanted to. I wasn't taking dance classes. I was having trouble doing them online. And I found myself, I have kids, I have a toddler right now, sitting on the floor, watching him play or trying to engage with him. And there are balls all over, little balls, big balls, squishy balls, hard balls. And my daughter at the same time in gym class, they were doing a juggling unit. I mean, she was in first grade or kindergarten at the time. They're not going to necessarily juggle. But I just had this thought of like, what if I taught myself to juggle? I don't know what that looks like. I have no idea how to do it. But playing with, again, all these play balls that I had around me, I just picked up 2 of the same size and I started like playing with the weight a little bit and shifting it. And I thought, well, how do I juggle things on a daily basis? Not well. And I threw everything up and just let it come crashing down. So it took some time, but I actually taught myself to, not well, but to juggle, embodying that metaphor of literally trying to keep balls up in the air physically and metaphorically and literally and mentally, so it's kind of like inviting in play, inviting in curiosity. When I go to the park with my kids, I don't do it 100% of the time, but I try to engage in the apparatuses. I try to go on the playground with them. And I'm not doing it for skill. I'm not trying to get better at the monkey bars. I'm just trying to be in my body instead of sitting on the bench on my phone, because that keeps me stuck. That keeps me on autopilot and it keeps me in my head. So giving ourselves permission to think out of the box of what we would normally do is challenging our movement. And so if there's a part of me that's like, I need to sit to recover, that's one thing. But if I'm sitting and it's not serving a purpose, then I think, what else could I be doing in this moment? And I will get up and take a walk with my kids, or I will go sit on the swing, and swing like I did when I was 6.
So I have an easier time, or I should say I'm more motivated to do things when I'm like checking off like 5 different goals at the same time. And an example of this
to-do lists.
Yeah. Well, an example of this is my long walk in the morning. I already love the long walk. That's movement. That's what I'm getting there. But also I'm getting fresh air first thing in the morning. I'm getting sunlight and the vitamin D. And I also walk without sunglasses so that my body acclimates or aligns to the circadian rhythm of the sun a little bit more, because I've read about the benefits for that. Part of my walk, I walk backwards up a hill because I have a knee issue.
Yeah, I do backwards a lot.
And I'm also in my barefoot style shoes so that I'm more stretching out my toes. So all of these things are happening at once. So when I'm skipping that walk, I'm not just skipping my movement, I'm skipping all of these things that add to my day. And so one thing that might be motivating for listeners when they're hearing about something like brushing your teeth with your non-dominant hand, because it isn't as fun to do things on the hand that we're less good at it. It's hard to actually stick to that.
It is. And we may have toothpaste all over our mouth and all over the counter, but we can clean it up. You can clean it. It's okay.
And studies have shown when you are doing something out of your pattern, like brushing with your non-dominant hand or giving yourself a high five with your non-dominant hand. This is like one of the biggest teachings in Mel Robbins' new book, The High Five Habit. Was all about the whole point of doing the high five is that it's not something that you normally do. It disrupts you from your pattern. So in that moment that you're doing one of these things to not only break out of your movement patterns, you can also use that time to say something that you really want to remember and drive into your subconscious. And so this can be if you're like studying for a test, like studying vocab or something like that, or giving yourself an affirmation that is trying to change the way you think. Like if you know there's something that you hold, a negative thought that always comes back, maybe use that time that you're also disrupting your patterns to then disrupt your thinking. And apparently studies have shown that it's more likely to be ingrained within your mind, or you learn it faster in those moments. So maybe that kind of habit stacking will help people.
Yeah, I mean, the body, there's so many benefits, right, to moving and being in our body, again, outside of just the physicality of it. I don't know that it's talked about a ton, but when you dive into the research, it's one of, if not the reason why dance is the most comprehensive form of exercise, because it's challenging all of the systems all the time: memory retention, cognition, patterning, movement, physicality, like it's all there. And you don't have to be a good dancer to engage and enjoy the benefits. But we talk ourselves out of it. We're like, I'm not good at that. I'm not going to do it. Right. Oh, I'm a terrible this. I'm not going to do it. Instead of approaching it again from this place of curiosity and imagination and play of like, so what if I'm not good at it? There's something good for me when I do it. And sometimes the less experience you have in it, the better, because it's really pushing you out of that comfort zone. It's really allowing you to step out of that box of autopilot, and of habit, of patterns that are not suiting us, not helping us get out of our own way. Yeah, there's so many ways we can challenge our movements. I do it driving. I drive different routes when I can, because my neighborhood's pretty much a grid. You don't have to go the same way all the time. I take different streets constantly, whether I'm on foot or actually in my car. And I have my kids, my daughter's like, this isn't the way home. I'm like, no, it is. This is another way home. There's lots of ways to get to our house. And it prevents me from being on autopilot, which sometimes is necessary, but we don't have to do it all the time. There are so many ways outside of that. I'm not a chef by any means, but there are so many things of convenience that keep us out of our bodies. We get things delivered. We get things pre-diced, chopped, sliced, cut, all that good stuff. If you're listening and you love to cook, get stuff fresh, cut it yourself, mix it yourself, slice it, dice it yourself. That's movement. And anytime you can engage in more movement, you can expand your capacity to manage your emotional terrain.
Well, there's so much to take away from this episode, and just, it's fun too, because new ways of moving, I mean, it's one of the most exciting or the most entertaining, enjoyable challenges that you can really do, or especially from a lot of the things that we've learned. So many of them are more mental, but just to get in our bodies and like dance. I had a habit, it's been a couple years now, but you're inspiring me to bring it back, where that was one of my things in the morning. It was one of my options for movement. It was just dance in my house, and I'd turn music on really loud, and I just haven't done that because there's nap times, but my baby loves music, and so every now and then I'll turn on music and kind of dance, but I should get deeper into my body, not just do the little encourage my baby to dance. So thank you for all of the wisdom that you shared and for sharing your story. And for listeners that are interested in learning more about you and your book, where's the best place for them to connect?
My website is ericahornthal.com. If you're a social media person, I tend to be more active on Instagram these days. My handle is The Therapist Who Moves You. Or if you're interested per se in my work, my writing, the book is called Body Aware, and it will be available in August wherever books are sold. So you can hop on the internet and check it out, order it at an independent store, wherever you want to, support. If you want to support your local communities, those are always great. But you can just search Body Aware Erica Hornthal and it'll pop up.
All the links for this episode will be at mindlove.com/X88. Your challenge for this week is to challenge your movement. Notice some of your default movement or even sitting patterns. How do you hold yourself when you sit? How do you carry yourself when you walk? Do you stand or walk or move differently when you're feeling down versus when you're feeling inspired or motivated? Can you take note of some of the ways that you do move when you're inspired and motivated? And can you just fake those when you're not? Take note of the way a change in movement makes you feel. I mentioned in the episode that I just like to get specific things throughout my day, especially in the morning, like a type of movement, a type of stillness, a type of nutrition. And while I like to keep a structured routine, the things within the routine might change. So I'm still spending time with myself, time finding that stillness or that movement, but the way that I move or the way that I'm still might change. So I encourage you to try that with movement. One of the habits that I find most rewarding is dancing like a crazy person. Dancing like literally no one is watching, because no one really is watching. But the freedom in that is that you're not trying to look good or even keep to the beat. You're just trying to get every inch of your body moving, flailing about, just releasing the energy that you're carrying. So maybe that's how you try this exercise. Maybe every morning you just turn on your favorite song and you just dance wildly. And if it helps to not even call it dancing and call it something more like flailing, go for it. Other ways to challenge your movement is if you always do yoga, try going for a run, or try Tai Chi, or try literally anything else just to break some of those patterns. But the key with any sort of self-challenge is to really take note of how you feel. When I first started trying to take note of how I feel, the changes were so subtle, I was like, I don't even know. But just that intention, that awareness started to grow. So set an intention to notice these changes and bring awareness to that every single day, and you will start to feel those changes in a bigger way. And once you notice the changes, that's when it's so easy to make something a habit. Well, I wouldn't say so easy. There's always a little bit of a challenge to it. Sometimes a lot of bit of challenge. But that's when it starts to become more motivating because you've found the intrinsic motivator. It's not just something that sounds nice anymore. You know that if you stop drinking, you feel more energy the next day. You feel your mood lifted the next day. I'm using a personal example. And once you know that certain types of movement make you feel more alive and more like the better version of yourself, the easier it is to come back to that practice over and over again. So let me know how it goes. Reach out to me on Instagram at MindLoveMelissa or leave a comment right on the show notes page at X88. If you'd like to support Mind Love, the best way to do that is by joining Mind Love Premium at mindlove.com/premium. You get early release episodes, an ad-free listening experience, over 50 exclusive episodes that are only available for premium members, and other bonuses like meditations. You can also leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, which is arguably one of my favorite things to receive in the entire world. And I just might read your review on the show if you do leave one. And you can also find all of my sponsors at mindlove.com/sponsors. And that's all for today. So thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next time.